Imagine a world where cities gleamed with gold, markets buzzed with merchants from across continents, and scholars studied mathematics, medicine, and astronomy with unmatched expertise. This was the reality of Black African civilizations centuries ago. From the grand libraries of Timbuktu to the thriving trade networks of Great Zimbabwe, Black Africans built societies that not only prospered but also shaped the course of human history. Their innovations in architecture, agriculture, and governance drew admiration and sometimes envy from visitors and neighboring regions. But despite these remarkable achievements, much of this history has been overlooked or misrepresented in mainstream narratives. The story of Black African ingenuity is not just a tale of wealth or power. It is a story of creativity, resilience, and leadership that challenged the world's assumptions about civilization and progress. These early societies laid foundations that influenced science, culture, and trade far beyond the African continent. In today's episode, we will explore why these achievements were perceived as a threat by some non-Black populations, and how those perceptions shaped global history. We will uncover the ways Black Africans were celebrated, envied, and, unfortunately, often misunderstood, and why recognizing their contributions is vital to understanding our shared human story. If you are ready to dive into a journey through history that celebrates the brilliance and resilience of Black African civilizations, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the full story. As Black African civilizations flourished, their influence extended far beyond the borders of their cities, reaching regions that had long been dominated by other powers. Travelers, traders, and emissaries who ventured into these lands often returned with stories of people whose physical strength, agility, and commanding presence seemed unmatched, leaving a lasting impression on those who had never witnessed such vitality before. The warriors of Mali, the skilled laborers of the Congo, and the athletic competitors in North African games displayed a combination of endurance, coordination, and charisma that made them stand out in every arena. From commerce to governance to military engagement, their presence was more than just impressive. It was unsettling to outsiders who measured status and power by their own cultural standards, which often prized delicacy, hierarchy, and control over brute strength. This admiration from some quickly turned into fear among others, especially as Black Africans demonstrated not only physical prowess but also strategic thinking and social cohesion. In towns and cities where trade and diplomacy intersected, African merchants and leaders commanded respect through negotiation skills and the ability to manage complex networks of resources and people. Further amplifying their perceived dominance, observers from Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia often felt a sense of unease, as the visible confidence and coordinated strength of African societies challenged the deeply ingrained notions of superiority they had carried into these encounters. Stories circulated back to foreign courts of individuals who could endure extreme physical labor, excel in battle, and inspire loyalty in their communities, leaving many to question whether their own ways of organizing society were as effective or even sustainable. In response to this growing perception, outsiders began to construct narratives that minimized these achievements, portraying Black Africans as dangerous or unruly in order to justify exclusion from positions of influence or to rationalize exploitative practices. These narratives painted strength as a threat rather than a virtue, framing natural resilience and communal leadership as something to be feared instead of celebrated. The resulting stereotypes became embedded in cultural, educational, and political systems, reinforcing the idea that Black Africans needed to be controlled, segregated, or otherwise limited in their ability to participate fully in global affairs. Yet beneath these false portrayals lay the undeniable reality that African communities had long mastered the art of balance between physical capability, social intelligence, and cultural expression, creating societies that could thrive under conditions that challenged even the most advanced foreign visitors. This complex interplay of admiration, fear, and misrepresentation highlights the enduring power of perception. The physical and charismatic presence of Black Africans was never simply about muscle or appearance. It represented a broader capacity for leadership, resilience, and strategic influence that made their societies formidable in ways that outsiders could neither ignore nor easily comprehend. The tension between recognition and fear, between respect and prejudice, would echo throughout centuries, shaping how Black Africans were treated, depicted, and remembered in historical records. Understanding this dynamic allows us to see that the story of African strength is inseparable from the story of human bias, and it reveals how perceptions of power can influence entire systems of social hierarchy, policy, and cultural memory, leaving a legacy that still resonates in discussions of race, equity, and human potential today. Beyond the visible strength and presence that left outsiders both impressed and unsettled, Black African civilizations cultivated minds that reshaped the intellectual landscape of the world long before many outside observers could recognize their contributions. In the bustling centers of learning in Timbuktu, scholars meticulously studied astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, producing texts that revealed sophisticated understanding of the natural world, the cosmos, and human anatomy. These were not isolated achievements but part of a continuum of intellectual exploration that connected generations of thinkers who were deeply curious, disciplined, and committed to advancing knowledge for the benefit of their communities. Libraries filled with manuscripts detailed mathematical techniques that anticipated later discoveries in Europe, methods of healing and herbal medicine that rivaled contemporary practices elsewhere, and systems of governance and law rooted in philosophy and ethics that provided stability and fairness within their societies. Architecture, too, became a canvas for African innovation, with cities designed not only for aesthetic grandeur but for functionality, sustainability, and social cohesion. Structures like the mud-brick mosques of Jenai and the stone terraces of Great Zimbabwe were not merely monuments. They embodied complex understanding of engineering principles, resource management, and artistic expression, blending utility with cultural identity in ways that communicated both power and purpose. Language and communication flourished alongside these achievements, with African societies developing written systems, oral traditions, and linguistic structures that preserved history, codified knowledge, and enabled the transmission of complex ideas across generations and regions. Philosophy and spirituality intertwined with these disciplines, framing human experience, morality, and societal organization within rich conceptual frameworks that emphasized interconnectedness, ethical responsibility, and the pursuit of wisdom. For travelers and emissaries from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, encountering such intellectual richness could be both inspiring and disconcerting. The evidence of profound knowledge, combined with physical capability and social organization, challenged preconceived notions of hierarchy and superiority that outsiders had long assumed as natural or universal. The accomplishments of African thinkers, architects, and scholars were often minimized, misattributed, or ignored entirely in historical records curated by those with vested interests in maintaining narratives of European dominance. Yet despite attempts to erase or downplay these achievements, the enduring artifacts of African intellect, manuscripts, buildings, and oral histories stand as a testament to centuries of ingenuity, critical thinking, and creativity that shaped not only the continent but the broader human story. What emerges from this history is a vision of Africa as a cradle of innovation, where mental acuity and creativity were as celebrated as strength and resilience. The intellectual achievements of African civilizations were not merely functional or utilitarian. They reflected a deep curiosity about the universe, a commitment to ethical governance, and an ability to solve complex problems with insight and elegance. Recognizing these contributions allows us to see that Black Africans were not only central to the development of human knowledge, but that their impact resonates in fields as varied as science, mathematics, medicine, architecture, and philosophy, challenging the simplistic and biased narratives that have dominated historical discourse for centuries. In understanding this legacy, it becomes clear that the story of African civilizations is inseparable from the broader story of human progress, and that the brilliance of their minds deserves acknowledgement, respect, and celebration as a foundational element of our shared intellectual heritage. Despite the remarkable achievements and profound contributions of Black African civilizations, the perception of threat they posed to non-Black societies became a tool for control and exploitation. Those who felt their own power challenged by African strength, intellect, and cultural sophistication began crafting narratives designed to diminish and dehumanize, casting Black Africans as inferior, unruly, and unworthy of autonomy. These narratives were not neutral observations but deliberate constructs, intended to justify practices that were both morally reprehensible and economically advantageous, most notably slavery. By portraying an entire population as less than human, those in power could rationalize the forced labor, brutal punishments, and systematic exclusion from positions of authority that became hallmarks of colonial and pre-colonial oppression. The process of dehumanization was subtle yet pervasive. Laws were written to codify inequality. Religious and philosophical arguments were adapted to claim moral superiority. And everyday language was manipulated to normalize the idea that Black Africans were naturally suited for servitude. For enslaved individuals, this meant that their physical and intellectual abilities, qualities that elsewhere commanded respect, were deliberately reframed as threats or aberrations to be contained. Slave owners and colonial administrators relied on fear, misinformation, and repetition to maintain social hierarchies, teaching successive generations that these stereotypes reflected objective truths rather than self-serving myths. Over time, these distorted perceptions seeped into broader cultural consciousness, influencing literature, art, education, and eventually mass media, so that even societies removed from the immediate context of slavery could internalize biased views about African people and culture. This system of oppression extended beyond the plantation and the colony, affecting opportunities for education, property ownership, and civic participation long after formal slavery ended. Even as African communities demonstrated resilience and ingenuity, access to resources and positions of influence remained restricted, reinforcing the perception that they were incapable of self-governance or intellectual achievement. The consequences of these beliefs were felt not only by individuals but by entire communities, as generations were denied the chance to fully realize their potential in the economic, political, and cultural spheres. What began as a method of rationalizing exploitation evolved into a deeply embedded social framework, sustaining systemic inequalities that continue to echo in contemporary institutions and public perceptions. Yet within these oppressive structures, stories of resistance, adaptation, and cultural preservation emerged, quietly challenging the false narratives imposed upon African populations. Communities maintained traditions of learning, governance, and art, creating networks of knowledge and cultural continuity that could not be entirely erased. The tension between imposed inferiority and lived excellence reveals how deeply fear and envy influenced historical oppression, illustrating that stereotypes were never reflections of reality but instruments of control. Understanding this history allows us to see that the narratives of inferiority were a mechanism to contain a population whose strength, physical, intellectual, and cultural was undeniable, and it emphasizes the enduring importance of recognizing the resilience, achievements, and humanity of Black Africans as central to the story of the human race. The denial of education to Black Africans was a calculated strategy, a deliberate effort to limit access to knowledge that might empower them to challenge entrenched systems of control. And it became one of the most insidious tools of oppression in history. Across colonies and regions influenced by European powers, laws were enacted to prevent Black people from learning to read or write, while even after emancipation, access to quality schooling remained scarce. Segregated and underfunded, this systemic deprivation was not accidental. It was rooted in fear, the same fear that had long accompanied African physical prowess. Intellectual achievement and societal influence. Education, after all, is the foundation of empowerment, a way to cultivate critical thinking, to organize communities, and to participate fully in civic life, and denying it effectively restricted upward mobility while reinforcing the narratives of inferiority imposed by those in power. The consequences of this educational suppression rippled through generations. Children who might have grown into scholars, leaders, or innovators were instead confined to environments designed to limit their intellectual potential. Schools that did exist were often overcrowded, poorly resourced, and staffed with instructors whose own biases reflected the broader societal prejudices of the time, reinforcing the idea that Black people were incapable of mastering complex subjects or contributing meaningfully to public life. Even as African families valued learning and sought ways to educate their children through community schools, secret study circles, and oral traditions, these efforts were continuously undermined by legal restrictions, economic pressures, and social stigmas that framed intellectual ambition as dangerous or unacceptable. This deliberate denial of education also intersected with other forms of oppression, including economic exploitation and political disenfranchisement. By restricting access to knowledge, those in power ensured that Black communities remained dependent, marginalized, and excluded from positions where they could influence policy or economic development. The perception of intellectual inferiority became self-reinforcing. A society that limited educational opportunity could point to its own restrictions as evidence of incapacity, creating a cycle of systemic inequality that would persist long after the abolition of slavery. The manipulation of education, therefore, was not merely a tool of control, it was a mechanism for shaping perception, for embedding fear, and for maintaining a hierarchy that privileged outsiders while suppressing African agency and innovation. Yet despite these barriers, resilience and ingenuity flourished. Secret schools, community-led teaching, and the preservation of cultural knowledge ensured that intellectual traditions endured. African thinkers, inventors, writers, and educators emerged even under conditions designed to suppress them, demonstrating that knowledge cannot be entirely extinguished when curiosity, creativity, and determination persist. The story of educational denial is thus inseparable from the story of resistance, illustrating both the lengths to which oppressive systems sought to maintain control and the enduring power of human potential to overcome systemic obstacles. Understanding this history reveals that education is more than literacy or formal instruction. It is a pathway to freedom, equality, and recognition, and the denial of it to Black Africans highlights both the depth of historical prejudice and the remarkable resilience of those who refused to let it define their destiny. As African civilizations thrived, attracting attention for their wealth, innovation, and influence, European and other non-Black powers began to encroach under the pretext of bringing civilization to the continent. But their true intentions were far more extractive. They arrived not merely as travelers or merchants but as colonizers, equipped with weapons, bureaucratic systems, and ideologies designed to justify domination. They framed their intrusion as a moral obligation, claiming to introduce education, religion, and governance to people they depicted as incapable of managing their own societies, all while masking the systematic exploitation of Africa's abundant natural resources: gold, ivory, timber, spices, and later, oil and precious metals became the instruments of wealth extraction that flowed out of the continent to enrich distant empires, leaving local populations deprived of the benefits of their own lands. The veneer of civilization served to obscure the brutality of these interventions. European powers created infrastructure and administrative systems primarily to facilitate resource extraction rather than to empower African communities. Building ports, railways, and roads that linked mines and plantations directly to export channels rather than local markets. Local labor was often coerced, undervalued, or enslaved, and resistance was met with force, further entrenching inequality and consolidating foreign control. The rhetoric of civilizing missions justified not only economic exploitation but also cultural erasure, as indigenous knowledge systems, languages, and institutions were devalued or suppressed in favor of European norms, creating a narrative in which African people were portrayed as passive recipients of progress rather than as active architects of sophisticated societies with rich traditions of science, governance, and commerce. This exploitation was not confined to distant history. Its effects ripple through modern Africa, where multinational corporations and foreign governments continue to extract resources, often through partnerships with local elites that prioritize profit over equitable development. Land acquisitions, mining concessions, and industrial-scale agriculture frequently displace communities, disrupt ecosystems, and funnel wealth away from the populations whose labor and ingenuity created it in the first place. The pattern echoes the earlier colonial era, demonstrating that the guise of benevolence can mask systematic inequities that perpetuate economic dependence and reinforce external control over African resources and opportunities. Moreover, the portrayal of Africa as a continent in need of guidance served to reinforce global stereotypes, suggesting that Africans were incapable of managing their wealth or building stable societies without foreign oversight. Media, literature, and academic discourse often highlighted poverty, conflict, or disease while ignoring centuries of achievement. Technological innovation and cultural richness, creating a skewed perception that continues to influence international relations. Investment decisions and global attitudes toward African nations. The dissonance between Africa's historical achievements and the narratives imposed by outsiders fueled misunderstanding, prejudice, and a sense of entitlement among non-African powers who justified intervention and resource extraction under the banner of moral or civilizational duty. Yet beneath this imposed narrative, the reality remains undeniable. Africa has always possessed immense wealth, human ingenuity, and cultural sophistication, and it has consistently been a central player in global trade, science, and thought. The challenge has always been ensuring that the benefits of these resources and achievements are recognized and shared equitably, rather than appropriated under the guise of paternalistic guidance. Understanding this history illuminates the ways exploitation was rationalized and highlights the resilience and resourcefulness of African societies, who have endured centuries of external pressure while maintaining and evolving their cultural, intellectual, and economic heritage, reminding the world that the true wealth of Africa is inseparable from the agency and creativity of its people. Even as African civilizations demonstrated ingenuity, wealth, and resilience, The stories reaching the rest of the world were often filtered through lenses that distorted reality, emphasizing struggle over achievement, chaos over organization, and poverty over prosperity. Western media, in particular, crafted narratives that portrayed Africa as a continent defined by conflict, famine, disease, and instability, a portrayal that obscured centuries of innovation, cultural richness, and social complexity. Newspapers, magazines, films, and later television and digital platforms repeatedly highlighted images of suffering and turmoil, often without context, framing African societies as perpetually in need of external aid or intervention. This selective representation reinforced existing prejudices, validating long-held assumptions about African inferiority and justifying policies, investments, and interventions that prioritized external interests over local development. The focus on negative imagery created a feedback loop. Audiences outside Africa internalized a vision of the continent that emphasized despair rather than accomplishment, while African nations faced challenges in attracting equitable investment, promoting tourism, or asserting cultural authority on the global stage. These narratives not only misrepresented the everyday realities of African life, which included thriving urban centers, marketplaces bustling with trade, and communities innovating in technology and agriculture, but they also obscured the historical context that had shaped contemporary conditions. Centuries of exploitation, forced labor, and resource extraction by colonial and foreign powers, combined with systemic suppression of education and local governance, were rarely acknowledged, leaving the impression that present challenges were inherent rather than the result of external interference. Moreover, the persistent framing of Africa as unstable extended beyond economics and politics to social and cultural dimensions, subtly undermining confidence in African leadership, innovation, and creativity. Stories of African artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, and intellectuals often struggled for international recognition, while the predominant narrative continued to emphasize calamity and scarcity. By prioritizing spectacle and sensationalism over nuance, Western media inadvertently or sometimes deliberately limited the perceived potential of African societies and individuals, reinforcing a cycle in which negative stereotypes constrained opportunities for economic development. Educational investment and global collaboration. This skewed representation also influenced perceptions within Africa itself. Generations of Africans were exposed to media depictions that undervalued their heritage and accomplishments, fostering a complex interplay of internalized bias and aspiration shaped by external expectations. Yet throughout this distorted portrayal, African communities continued to cultivate education, arts, governance, and entrepreneurship, demonstrating resilience in the face of narratives designed to undermine their agency. Despite challenges, initiatives in technology, agriculture, medicine, and the arts flourished, often quietly, building local solutions and achievements that contrasted sharply with the narrow depiction presented to the world. The dissonance between Africa's actual history and contemporary reality and the stories propagated in Western media reveals the power of narrative in shaping global perception. By reducing a diverse and multifaceted continent to a series of crises, these portrayals contributed to systemic inequities, influencing everything from foreign aid distribution to corporate investment priorities, while simultaneously denying recognition to African innovation and leadership. Understanding this dynamic underscores the importance of critical engagement with media narratives and the need to elevate authentic African voices, perspectives, and achievements. It reminds us that Africa's story is not one-dimensional, that its people have continually demonstrated creativity, intelligence, and resilience, and that the continent's true potential can only be appreciated when historical accomplishments, contemporary innovations, and cultural richness are allowed to shine alongside, rather than be overshadowed by the narratives of crisis that have dominated for so long. Throughout history, the remarkable physical, intellectual, and cultural presence of Black Africans provoked fear among non-Black populations, not only on the level of societal power or wealth but also in deeply personal and genetic terms. The idea that African traits strength, resilience, intelligence, and distinctive appearance could influence future generations became a source of anxiety for those who sought to maintain social hierarchies rooted in racialized notions of superiority. Intermarriage between Black Africans and non-Black populations was framed as a potential threat, as it challenged the rigid boundaries that had been carefully constructed to preserve control and privilege. The concern was not merely social but pseudo-scientific, grounded in fears that African genes, perceived as dominant, might overwhelm or reshape the characteristics of non-Black populations, erasing the markers of lineage and cultural identity that were central to prevailing notions of racial hierarchy. This fear manifested in laws, customs, and violent enforcement, designed to prevent unions across racial lines. Black people were often forbidden from marrying non-Black partners, and in many regions, anti-miscegenation laws codified these restrictions, criminalizing relationships that threatened the established order. Such regulations were justified through the lens of preserving social order, but underlying them was a deeper anxiety about the transmission of African traits and the disruption of artificial constructs of racial purity. These measures reflected a broader pattern in which Black Africans were simultaneously dehumanized and feared, reduced to objects to be controlled while their very existence was seen as a potential disruption to established societal hierarchies. At the same time, these prohibitions revealed a profound respect, however unacknowledged, that African populations commanded. Their genetic vitality, physical capabilities, and cultural influence were recognized even by those who sought to suppress them, and the very measures designed to contain these influences inadvertently confirmed the significance of African presence in shaping human societies. Across continents, Black Africans became central to anxieties about inheritance, lineage, and identity, and these fears were often intertwined with economic, political, and social motivations. Preventing intermarriage was a way to maintain control over property, labor, and status, ensuring that the perceived advantages of African strength and knowledge did not extend beyond circumscribed boundaries. Yet human resilience and the desire for connection persisted despite these restrictions. Relationships that defied legal and social prohibitions often emerged in secret, creating complex networks of kinship and cultural exchange that challenged the rigid categories imposed by oppressive systems. Over time, the presence of African genes in diverse populations across the globe became undeniable, revealing the limitations of attempts to contain the influence of African ancestry. Modern genetic research confirms what history and lived experience suggested all along. The legacy of Black Africans is intertwined with that of every human population, and their contributions, biological, cultural, and intellectual, cannot be confined by artificial boundaries or legal restrictions. This historical anxiety over African genetics underscores the deep-seated nature of the perceived threat, demonstrating that the impact of Black Africans extended beyond visible achievements into the very foundation of human identity and heredity. It reveals how systemic control, prejudice, and fear were leveraged to maintain hierarchy, even as the reality of human interconnectedness quietly undermined these efforts. Understanding this history allows us to see that attempts to restrict intermarriage were not reflections of African inferiority, but rather admissions of African influence and vitality. And it challenges contemporary society to recognize that the richness of African heritage is not a threat but a shared inheritance, shaping the world in ways that continue to resonate across generations. Long before modern science illuminated the origins of humanity, Black Africans had already left an indelible mark on the trajectory of civilizations through their strength, intellect, culture, and ingenuity. Yet for centuries, the broader world clung to Eurocentric narratives that minimized or ignored their central role in human history, constructing stories of superiority that positioned Europe as the cradle of civilization while casting Africa as peripheral, primitive, or chaotic. These narratives were maintained through selective education, media representations, and social hierarchies that denied Black Africans both recognition and agency. However, recent advances in genetic research have challenged these long-held assumptions in a way that is both profound and irrefutable. The overwhelming majority of modern humans trace their ancestry back to Africa, revealing that the continent is not just a participant in human history, but the very origin of our species. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, chromosome inheritance, and genome-wide analysis consistently indicate that African populations possess the greatest genetic diversity, reflecting the deep history of human evolution on the continent. As humans migrated across the globe tens of thousands of years ago, African genes spread into Europe, Asia, and the Americas, leaving traces that persist in every population today. This evidence undermines the idea of any inherent racial hierarchy, showing that all humans are interconnected at the most fundamental level, and that the diversity observed across populations is a product of adaptation, migration, and cultural evolution rather than a marker of superiority or inferiority. The recognition that Black Africans are the ancestors of all humanity reframes historical and contemporary narratives, highlighting the profound influence of Africa not only on early human development but on the genetic, cultural, and intellectual heritage of the entire world. Understanding this reality also sheds light on the deep-seated fear and prejudice that historically motivated the marginalization of Black Africans. If Africa is the birthplace of humanity and Black Africans are the genetic forebears of all people, then claims of European or other non-African superiority are revealed as social constructs designed to rationalize domination rather than truths grounded in science or history. The very foundations of these narratives, built on selective storytelling, legal codes, and cultural biases, collapse under the weight of genetic evidence, exposing the contradictions between perceived social hierarchies and biological reality. In many, this knowledge reframes centuries of human history, revealing that the achievements, innovations, and resilience of Black Africans were never anomalies but expressions of the very source of human capability. Moreover, the implications extend beyond the academic or historical. They influence how societies understand identity, belonging, and equality. Recognizing the African origins of all people challenges entrenched systems of discrimination and prejudice, inviting a reassessment of power structures and cultural narratives that have long marginalized African contributions. It emphasizes that the histories of slavery, colonization, and systemic oppression are not separate from human evolution, but are chapters in a story that originates from Africa, reinforcing the idea that understanding and valuing this heritage is essential to building equitable and inclusive societies. Ultimately, genetic evidence does more than correct historical misconceptions. It reclaims the narrative of humanity, placing Africa at its center and affirming that Black Africans are not peripheral to history, but foundational to it. Their contributions physical, intellectual, cultural, and genetic are intertwined with the story of every human being, and acknowledging this truth challenges us to confront past prejudices, celebrate shared origins, and redefine global narratives in a way that honors the depth, resilience, and creativity of African civilizations. It is a reminder that the story of humanity cannot be told without Africa. For in every genome lies a testament to the continent's central role in shaping the world as we know it. As we reflect on the rich history, remarkable achievements, and enduring resilience of Black Africans, it becomes clear that acknowledging and celebrating their contributions is not merely a matter of correcting historical records, it is an essential step toward dismantling the systemic prejudices that continue to shape our world. From the earliest civilizations that laid the foundations for mathematics, science, and architecture, to the cultural innovations, philosophical insights, and social structures that influenced societies across the globe, African people have been central to the human story. Yet for centuries, these achievements were minimized, erased, or distorted by narratives designed to justify exploitation, marginalization, and inequality. Recognizing the truth of African history challenges these falsehoods, empowering communities to reclaim pride in their heritage while encouraging the broader world to confront biases that have long limited understanding, opportunity, and justice. Celebrating African culture and contributions goes beyond admiration for the past. It has profound implications for the present and future. By shining a light on the intellect, creativity, and leadership of African people, societies can inspire new generations to embrace education, innovation, and civic engagement, knowing that their potential is not constrained by outdated stereotypes or systemic barriers. Understanding Africa's pivotal role in shaping global history fosters cross-cultural respect and collaboration, breaking down the walls of ignorance and fear that have too often divided communities. When African achievements are recognized on equal footing with those of any other civilization, it creates a foundation for equitable representation in education, media, politics, and industry, ensuring that diverse voices and perspectives are valued and heard. Moreover, celebrating African heritage reminds us that systemic inequality is not inevitable, but a product of historical distortions and deliberate manipulation of power. It encourages accountability and conscious action, whether that means supporting equitable policies, investing in African-led initiatives, or challenging harmful narratives wherever they appear. Recognizing the interconnectedness of all human histories, with Africa at the center of our shared origins, fosters empathy and global responsibility, illustrating that justice and equity are not abstract ideals but achievable goals grounded in truth and understanding. It is through this lens that we can begin to repair the damage wrought by centuries of marginalization, creating spaces where African voices, talents, and contributions are respected and amplified. As we honor the legacy of African civilizations and the resilience of their people, we also acknowledge the responsibility each of us carries in shaping a more just and equitable world. By learning, sharing, and celebrating African history and culture, we contribute to dismantling prejudice and building societies where opportunity, recognition, and respect are accessible to all, regardless of background. Let us embrace this responsibility, not only as a moral imperative but as a celebration of the shared human story that unites us across continents and generations. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history and culture. If you found this story insightful, inspiring, or eye-opening, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to continue exploring the rich history, culture, and achievements of Black Africans around the world. Your support helps us share these stories and promote understanding, equity, and appreciation for the invaluable contributions of African civilizations. Together, we can celebrate the past, learn from it, and build a future grounded in respect, knowledge, and shared humanity.